Welcome to this tutorial on creating data models in PowerPivot within Excel 2013. It's the fifth in a series of tutorials on using the Power BI tools in Excel. Here's what you'll learn in the tutorial. We'll begin by looking at what we're trying to achieve, and then we'll look at how to get tables in from SQL Server and import them into a data model. We'll look at how to choose which rows and columns you want to import, and then how to simplify the data model by hiding certain tables and certain columns from the client tools so they don't appear in the pivot table field list. We'll then look at how to add tables into an existing data model and solve problems which may arise, and how to create relationships between tables in a data model so that the pivot table works okay. And finally, we'll have a look at how to create a pivot table based on the data model that we've created and solve any problems which arise at this point. So let's get started. Before we begin with creating a data model in PowerPivot, I thought it would be a good idea to look at what we're trying to achieve. We'll begin by creating a full data model like the one shown here, with 9 tables joined together with relationships, and based on that we'll create a table which will look okay. It will display the total quantity of sales by species and by region. But the pivot table fields on the right hand side will look a bit messy because we won't have done any simplification. What we'll then do is take that data model, clean it up. So we'll get rid of fields and tables we're not interested in, hide from the client view tables and columns which we don't want to see in the pivot table, and the result of that will be the pivot table will look much neater. On the right hand side you'll only have the columns and tables you're interested in, and we'll apply an additional filter so we'll only show transactions where at least 2 items were bought at a time. So that's what we're trying to achieve. Let's begin by starting to import the tables from SQL Server, and we'll see how far we get. To import tables into PowerPivot, the first thing to do from Excel is to click on the PowerPivot tab if you haven't already done so, and go to Manage. What we can then do is choose where to get the data from. I'm going to get mine from SQL Server. In a tutorial later in this series we'll look at other data sources. I'm going to give my connection a friendly name so I can refer to it in the future. And I'm going to call it MAM, standing for Make a Mammal. The server name, in my case, will be /SQL 2012. Yours will be different according to which SQL Server instance you installed it on, and you may need to change Windows Authentication to SQL Server Authentication and type in a name or password. I don't. I can just choose my database, MAM, and click on the next button and the next again to choose to import tables. I'm going to start with the transaction table, so I'll tick that. At this point you need to understand your underlying database. There's some of the tables in my Make a Mammal database and what they look like, and the one I've just selected to import is a transaction table. Directly related to that are 2 other tables, TBL Product and TBL POS. So what I can do is go back to my import screen and I can click on the Select Related Tables button, and what PowerPivot will do is add in the POS and the product table because they're directly related to the one I had initially selected. I could proceed along these lines, but it has a habit of over-selecting tables. So what I'm going to do instead is just add in the store, the animal and the species table. For the moment I'm going to miss out these 3 tables at the bottom left, the region, town and centre, because I'll show how to add them in after you've done your initial import and the problems that creates. So I'll go back to my initial list of tables to import, and I'll add in the 3 I specified, the store, and scrolling up, the animal, and also the species. Now, but just before I continue, I'm going to give my tables friendly names. This one's called TBL Animal in the underlying SQL Server database, but it would be nice if I could refer to it without the TBL prefix. It's a bit of a techie, geeky name, and it'll be one which your users will thank you for hiding from them. So it's a good idea when you're importing tables into PowerPivot to give them all simpler names so they're easier to work with. So that completes the specification for which tables I'm going to import. Normally you would now click on Finish and they would pop up in the PowerPivot database diagram or data diagram, but I'm now going to work with choosing which rows and which columns I want to import, so for the moment we'll leave this dialog box open. So what I'm now going to do is to limit down the number of rows I'm importing for some tables and limit the number of columns I'm importing for nearly all of them. Let's start with the rows. On the Transactions table, there's a button at the bottom right, having selected it, called Preview and Filter. If I click on this, what I can do is decide exactly what I'm going to import. What I'm going to do is limit the quantity down to say only import rows where there were at least 2 items bought at the same time. To the right of every single column is a little drop arrow, and if I click on that, I can change my number filter. In this case, I'm going to say choose all the ones where the quantity bought is greater than 1, and I'll then choose OK. You can see it changes the symbol to show a filter's been applied to that, and if I choose OK, you can see it says applied filters. If I want to edit the filter, I can actually click on that link and it will tell me what filter's been applied to it. Otherwise, I'd have to click on Preview and Filter to go back into the dialog box where I could change my filter. So let's change the rows being imported. For everything else, I'll just import all of the rows for all the other tables. But what I'm now going to do is limit down the number of columns being imported. Start with the animal table. If I click on that and click on Preview and Filter, I need to consider whether I need all of these columns. The two I definitely need are the animal ID and the species ID. I need the animal ID because it's linking to the product table, and I need the species ID because it's linking to the species table. So even though these values aren't going to appear in my final pivot table, I can't untick them. What I don't need is the animal name or how many legs it's got. They're of no interest to me in my final pivot table, so I can deselect those and then choose OK. I can then go to my POS table and do the same thing, click on Preview and Filter. In this case, I'm not interested in the POS date, and I'll need to widen these columns so I can just see what they say. I'm also not interested in the staff ID. But I will need the store ID and the POS ID because they're link fields. I can choose OK for that. For the product table, I can do the same thing. I'm not interested in the product name, nor am I interested in any of the other fields. And it occurs to me it might be easier to actually use this little tick box on the left hand side. What that will do is deselect all of the columns, and then I can just tick the ones I want, which are the product ID and the animal ID. I can then choose OK for that. For the species, I can do the same for this, but I actually need both columns. I need the species ID because that's what's being used to link to the animal table, and I need the species name because I want to display that in my final pivot table. So I'll just leave that as it is. For the store table, I don't need the store name, but I do need the store ID and the center ID because they're linking to other tables. And finally, for the transactions table, I can choose which columns. I could of course have done this when I had the dialog box open previously. From this table, the columns I probably need are the price and the quantity, so I can display those in my pivot table. I need the product ID and POS ID so I can link to other tables, but I don't need the unique transaction ID. It may seem that that's a bit of overkill, and it probably was because I've only got a few hundred or a few thousand records. But imagine if you had a few million records. For every column you can avoid importing, you will reduce the size of the final workbook. So when I choose Finish, as I'm going to now to import the data, you can see rather than importing 13,000 odd transactions, it's only imported just over 4,000, because I'm only bringing in the data where somebody bought at least 2 items at a time. And although the number of rows for all the other tables hasn't changed, the number of columns has, and I've hugely reduced the amount of data being imported. So it's worth taking your time to think which columns and which rows you actually want to bring in to your final PowerPivot spreadsheet so that you can reduce the amount of data and the file size. If I now go into diagram view, you can see it's brought in all my 6 tables, and what I could do is rearrange it to make them look a bit neater. Another useful tool to click on is this one which says Fit to Screen, and what that will do is resize everything so it fits onto a single screen. At the moment it has had very little effect, but if I just make my diagram look a bit smaller and more concise, let's look at it like that, you can see when I click on Fit to Screen, it expands everything so it fills up the entire screen. What we're going to do now is to create a pivot table, look at the messy pivot table fields this creates, and then tidy them up by cleaning up the data model. Let's start with creating the pivot table. I can click on this tool to create a pivot table, choose to put it on a new worksheet, and what Excel will present me with is all of the tables in the underlying data model. That's probably okay for me because I know what the tables are, but it's very confusing for a user who won't know what things like product ID and animal ID are for and won't know that actually they should be ignored. So what we're going to do is go back into the underlying data model and tidy it up. Let's start with this store table. The user doesn't want to see it or its fields, so what we're going to do is right-click on it and choose to hide it from Client Tools. Two things will happen then. One is it will go in fainter grey, and the other is that when I go back into Excel, the store table has vanished from my list of possible tables to choose from. In previous versions of PowerPivot, people may have seen there was a refresh button up here which you had to click on, but they've cleverly got rid of the need for that and things refresh automatically. So that worked well. Let's do this for more tables. The POS and the product tables don't want to be visible either to the user, so I can use the Control key to select them both at the same time and right-click and hide them from Client Tools. For the animal table, I'm going to go to Data View just by way of variety, and I can right-click on this table here and choose to hide that from Client Tools too. And you can see the colour scheme changes for that. The only ones I've got left are the transaction and the species tables. Back to Diagram View. For the transaction table, the only things I want to be able to see are the price and the quantity. So I'm going to use the Control key to select the other two columns, and again right-click and hide them from Client Tools. For the species table, I'll hide the species ID, but let's go back to Data View to do that just to show it's possible. You can right-click on the species ID column, and you can choose to hide that from Client Tools. And again, visually, you can see what's happened. What I'll be left with then is just the price and quantity columns from the transaction table and the species name column from the species table. So if I now go back into Excel, you can see that's what happens. And if I want to create a pivot table, showing for example total quantity by species, then it's very much easier to do that. Incidentally, if you're not a bit wary about pivot tables, the next part of this tutorial series will show how to create pivot tables in PowerPivot in much more detail. That's all very well, but I'm still missing the region name, so what I now need to do is go back in and amend my data model to add in more tables and to have a look at relationships. The three tables I'm missing from my database diagram are the region, the town and the centre, so I need to add those in. So to do that, what I need to do is bring them in from the SQL Server database. However, what I don't need to do is go to From SQL Server again, because what that will do is create a separate connection to a database when I've already got a perfectly good existing one. So instead I'm going to go to Existing Connections and click on that, and you can see listed there the connection which I've created previously. We called it MAM, and I'm glad I did now because it makes it easier to find. So what I can do is click on that and choose Open to open it. Again, I'm going to be listing our tables and views, and I'm going to bring in the three missing tables, which are the center table, the region table, and the town table. I'm deliberately not going to rename or choose the columns because I want to do that later. If I then choose Finish, it will import those rows. I can then close that dialog box down, and then it's a good idea to click on this tool I showed earlier to fit everything onto a single screen. You can see I've got two problems. One is that I didn't rename the tables or choose which columns I wanted to import. And the second problem is that I'm missing a relationship. This center table should be linked to this store table, and it isn't. Let's solve the problems in that order. Beginning with the first problem, what I'm going to do is change the properties of this center table to say I want to import different columns and give it a different name. The obvious way to do this doesn't work. If I right-click on the center table and choose to look for the Properties option on the shortcut menu, it isn't there. It isn't even on the Home tab either. Bizarrely, it's actually on the Design tab, and there it is, Table Properties. I'm not quite sure why Microsoft made it so hard to get to. So what I can now do is choose which columns I'm going to import. I want the center ID because that's a linked column, but I don't want the center name. I need the town ID because that's a linked column, but I don't need any of these other columns. So I'm just going to untick all of them. I could also choose to change the center table name to just center, but as you can see from that attempt, it won't actually let me do it now. So what I'll have to do is choose Save to save those changes. It will refresh my data and just bring in the columns I've asked for, so the size of the eventual file will have been reduced. And what I can now do is rename it here by right-clicking on the table, choosing Rename, and getting rid of the TBL. So that's one way to change the properties of a table that you've imported. You can click on it to select it, go to the Design tab and click on Table Properties. However, for the town table we're going to do it a much simpler way. The only column I don't need now in is the town name column. So I can either press delete on that or right click on it and choose delete, and what it will do is permanently delete this column from the model. It's important to stress, of course, that that removes it from the underlying Excel workbook, but has absolutely no effect on the table in SQL Server from which you're importing it. Nothing you do in PowerPivot can delete information from within SQL Server. So that's gone. I'll also rename the table, so right click and choose rename and get rid of the TBL. And then for the region table, I'll switch back to data view just to show that you can do most things in both views. I'll rename the TBL region table by right-clicking on it and choosing rename and getting rid of the TBL at the beginning. And I'll also get rid of all the columns I don't need, which are the quadrant ID and the region manager. I've just tried using the control key and discovered that it doesn't work, so I'll do it one by one. Maybe there's a way to do that, in which case you can do that as an exercise for the reader or the viewer. So I've now got all my tables. What I now need to do is create the relationship between the center and the store table. Before we create the relationship between the center table and the store table, let's have a look at an existing relationship. And what I'm going to do is choose one of the simplest ones, the one between regions and towns. I hope it's reasonably obvious that every region in the country, we're talking about the UK here I'm afraid, has got a number of different towns within it. In terms of one-to-many relationships, this is the parent, the region, and each region has lots of children, which are the individual towns. This is the one end of the relationship, and this is the many end of the relationship. In a relational database, every relationship you create is always one-to-many or parent to child, and you should always identify which is a parent and which is a child. You can edit a relationship not by right-clicking on it, which does nothing, but by double-clicking. And it comes up with this dialog box which explains something about the way the relationship is working. What this is saying is on the left hand side, for each town, you look up in the regions table which region it belongs to. If you click off that, you can see there's also a drop arrow showing for each town you look up towards a table which contains the regional data. The confusing thing about this for anybody who's done any relational database design or worked with Access or SQL Server is that it's exactly the opposite way around from the way it would normally work. Normally the arrow points towards a child, and normally you create the relationship by dragging from the parent to the child. In PowerPivot it's exactly the other way around. When you create a relationship, you drag from the child to the parent. In this case, the child is a store, and each store belongs to a shopping centre. So what I need to do is find the centre ID in the store table and drag it onto the centre ID in the centre table, and then release the mouse button, and it will automatically create the relationship. It didn't actually matter which way round I did that. Had I done it the other way round, it would have still created exactly the same relationship. Because PowerPivot will realise that the centre ID uniquely defines which centre you're looking at in this table, it's sometimes called a primary key, then it will recognise the fact that this is the table you're looking up in and this is the table you're looking up from. If you're not used to using relational databases, you'll probably like PowerPivot's approach because it tends to hide the complexity of what's going on from the user. But if, like me, you come from a database design background, you'll wonder how you create outer joins. The answer is you can't, and you'll wonder why this arrow points the wrong way. So I've now created my final relationship, and what I should now be able to do is create my pivot table in Excel and have a look at that. I've already created a pivot table, so all I need to do now is to go back into Excel and have a look at it. You can see I've forgotten to hide the centre, region and town tables from Client View. So I quickly need to go back into PowerPivot, into the data model. I'll start with the town and centre tables, select them both with the control key, right click and hide them from Client Tools. And it makes sense to hide the region ID from Client Tools too, because that's of no interest to my user either. Now if I go back into Excel, I can see just the columns and just the tables I'm interested in. I can then drag the region name down and put that as one of the rows. I can drag the species and make that one of my columns. And I've got the final pivot table which I showed at the beginning of this tutorial. Strictly speaking, it's not exactly the same because I made one more change. If you go to the Design tab, what I did is chose to remove all my grand totals. I'll cover that in more detail on the next section of this tutorial series on pivot tables. And that's exactly what I had at the beginning of the tutorial. Now there's just one more thing I'd like to mention, which is the need for creating relationships. Supposing I actually go back into PowerPivot and delete the relationship which I created earlier. I can do that by pressing the delete key and choosing delete from model. If I now go back into Excel, the data will change, and you can see that's clearly wrong. There's no way sales can be identical for every single region. Another clue that I've got a problem is the presence of this create button. Excel's trying to warn me that I've got a problem. If ever in PowerPivot you have tables which aren't all linked together, it's likely to give you wrong answers. If I go back into Excel, I can click on this create button and I can create the relationship, but it doesn't give me many clues. So by far the easiest thing to do is to go back into PowerPivot, and just to prove what I said earlier, I'll actually create the relationship the wrong way round. Even though I've just dragged from the parent to the child, which I explained is the wrong way to do it, it still successfully created the relationship because it's worked out from the data in the two tables what I actually meant. So now if I go back into Excel, it will refresh the data and give me the final answers. If you like what you've seen and heard so far, why not head over to the WiseOwl website, where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.